Hello, IB History. This series of videos is designed to review the presentations that were given in class and also to serve as an accompaniment for our textbook that we're using. So you can use these videos in case you missed a class or if you are reviewing for a quiz or a test or the IB exam. This could serve as a nice refresher. It's not going to be quite as involved as our in-class lectures, but it'll give you a quick refresher. This video is going to cover part of the first bullet point for section 7. We're going to be looking at the nature and structure of imperial rule under the Qing dynasty. For our text, Jonathan Spence's The Search for Modern China, I had you start reading a few chapters in, so the information in this video is going to cover some concepts that are mentioned in Spence's book, but they're not really elaborated upon as I had you start reading a few chapters into the book. So what I'd like you to get out of this video is an understanding of the multi-ethnic nature of Qing China and also modern China, a better understanding of the Middle Kingdom concept, a better understanding of what exactly the Grand Canal was and how it worked and why it was so important, as it gets mentioned a number of times in our course. And then I want to talk about the different factions within the Qing imperial court. As a reminder, for those of you that are not studying Mandarin or those of you that don't speak Mandarin, the means by which we write Chinese characters in English, what we use today is pinyin. This is a system that was created by Chinese scholars in the 20th century. I think PRC scholars with the help of the Soviet Union, I think. But before that, there was a system that there were various systems Westerners had created, and one that was very prevalent was the Wade-Giles system. I'm mentioning this to you because if you look down here at this screen grab I took, there are different ways of pronouncing the same person or place in Chinese. And I want you to be aware of these different spellings because if we look at a primary source or if we look at a source that was even a book by a historian from the 30s or the 50s or even up to the 80s, they may be using the Wade-Giles system. So instead of saying Beijing, the capital of China, they would say Peking or Peking. Instead of saying Nanjing, they would say Nanking or Nanking. All right, so the first big point, who are the Chinese? Well, it's important to understand that China is a multi-ethnic state. Today, the PRC officially recognizes 56 ethnic groups within China. One of those is the Han, and that's the majority ethnic group. The Han comprise about 90, maybe a little more than 90% of China's population. Now, the 55 others, though they're less than 10% of China's population, they played an important role in China's history. And so, therefore, it's important for us to understand China was a multi-ethnic state. So that's true today, and it was true during the Qing Empire, because as you know, under the early Qing leaders, the borders of China expanded greatly, and they took in a lot of new territory that was inhabited by non-Han people. And in fact, the Qing themselves were not Han, they were of a different ethnic group, which we'll talk about later in this slideshow. Now, this map here is a more modern map with modern boundaries of China. I'm using the map to illustrate that these ethnic minority groups, though they might be 1% or a fraction of 1% of China's population, they live in highly concentrated numbers. And so that means that they have very distinct history, culture, language, cuisine, and so forth. And at times in China's history, they will have a political agenda that is different from the Qing dynasty or the PRC. For example, there are Muslim revolts under the Qing dynasty, or there's a Tibetan revolt under the PRC. To really drive the point home, I showed you these images here because I wanted to convey to you that these peoples are very distinct. The Qing Empire was a multi-ethnic empire, and China today is a multi-ethnic state. So if you take the Uyghurs, for example, who live way out in the far west in Xinjiang province, they have almost nothing in common culturally, historically, with Han people. As a matter of fact, they have far more in common with their neighbors across the border in Afghanistan. The purpose of this slide is I just want to plant a seed for a concept we're going to be talking about throughout this course. You have to know a bit of historiography as part of the IB program. The traditional historiographical narrative that China has told themselves is that the Chinese dynasties were, there was a succession of Chinese dynasties. Most of them were Han, and the Han people came up with all sorts of ingenious philosophical systems, inventions, economic systems. And for that reason, China flourished. Periodically, China would be ruled by a non-Han dynasty, two notable examples, the Mongol Yuan dynasty and the Manchu Qing dynasty. But in this traditional telling, the main reason why the non-Han dynasties succeeded is because they adopted Han policies, cultural practices, language, etc. So they non-Han people sinicized, and that is what made them successful. Well, there's another school of thought that emerged in the late 80s, definitely by the 1990s, starting with Taiwanese scholars. These Taiwanese scholars gained access to Chinese Qing dynasty archives that had been unavailable under the time period of the PRC with Mao Zedong. With Mao's passing and China opening up, the Taiwanese scholars gained access to these materials, and it caused them to shift their thinking a bit, and they started to argue that while the Manchu did adopt a number of Han cultural practices, they remained distinctly Manchu in a variety of other ways. So again, I'm showing you this now because I want to plant the seed that there are these different historiographical schools of thought. And there is this school, which today has branched off into many different disciplines, this school called New Qing history, which will come up again in this course. So while today I am focusing on the Qing dynasty, I'm going to, for the next couple slides, I'm going to jump back to the Ming dynasty to tell a story really quickly. And that's the story of the Ming voyages. So the Ming dynasty was a Han dynasty. They had an emperor, Yongle, who, for a variety of reasons that we don't need to get into, decided to commission a fleet of giant ships, ocean-going ships, not river boats or coastal ships. And these ocean-going ships were going to go on a voyage of exploration throughout the Indian Ocean. In total, they went on 7 voyages, starting in 1405, and these voyages were led by a Muslim eunuch named Zheng He, who was chosen probably in part because as a Muslim, he would have some cultural connection to the peoples throughout the Indian Ocean, as the religion of Islam had spread from all throughout that area, from East Africa all the way over to Indonesia. Now, as I had mentioned in class, I spent a lot of time talking about how this was really amazing. The fleets were enormous. The size of the ships were far larger than anything Europe was producing at the time. This was decades before Columbus. Now, these fleets of ships traveled to places that China had some knowledge of. They knew of these places because traders from the merchants from the Indian Ocean had come to China and shared with the Chinese their knowledge. This treasure fleet was met mostly positively. They were met with interest. They exchanged tribute with the peoples who they met. There were instances where the Ming, would intervene in a local political dispute, or they would fight pirates. There was some violence, but by and large, these were peaceful voyages that brought back tribute to the Yongle Emperor. With that being said, though, the voyages did not discover any place that the Chinese were completely unaware of, nor did the voyages bring back anything really remarkable that really impressed the Chinese. Now, they did bring back some things like a giraffe, and the Chinese thought that was such an interesting novelty, but nothing really substantial, some trade good or technology that could really help or benefit China. Just a larger map showing you the scope of these voyages. They ultimately made it all the way to the coast of East Africa, which is really impressive. So then in class, this begs the question, um, if all this effort was put into these voyages and they were exploring all the way over to East Africa, why then did the voyages suddenly stop? Because they did. The voyages ended abruptly, and the Chinese government they dismantled the fleet, and they even tried to destroy the records of the voyages having taken place. So here's an opportunity for you to hit pause on this video, think about what you would say in response to this question, and then I will show you the answer. Sorry, I should say I will tell you the answer. So a few of the things that we discussed in class were that the voyages were extremely expensive and they weren't yielding anything of value to China. The places that they went were places that China already had at least a cursory understanding of, and China had a lot of domestic problems. Um, they had the threat of invasion coming from the north. Um, and if we look at China's philosophical system, Confucianism, um, this extravagant outlay of money for these overseas voyages that have seemingly really limited value for China domestically, that all goes against Confucian values. This results in a policy of isolation, which will continue into the Qing dynasty, which is why I'm telling the story. By the time of the Qing dynasty, um, the Qing will not be putting great emphasis in maintaining even a naval fleet, and they certainly have no interest in overseas exploration. Now, something that these Ming voyages did do for China is it contributed to a already existing concept, the Middle Kingdom concept. So the name for China in Chinese is Zhongguo, which can translate as Middle Kingdom or Central Country. And that is to say, the Chinese saw themselves as the center of the universe geographically and culturally. They were the cultural hearth. They were the origin point for civilization, and the places around them merely existed in their shadow, borrowing from them in an attempt to become as cultured and sophisticated as they were. This idea is not unique to China. You know, the ancient Greeks saw the other as barbarian, the Romans the same. The subjects of the British Empire saw the people outside of Britain as being somehow inferior to them. So not a unique idea in history, but a very strongly held belief within China. What were some things that contributed to this belief? Well, the Ming voyages. The Chinese thought that they were the center of the universe, and then they spent tons and tons of resources exploring the world to find that, yes, in fact, there wasn't anything out there they didn't know about, and people were more than happy to give them tribute and recognize their greatness. Another point, calculating the GDP of pre-modern countries is fraught, so take this with a grain of salt, but in pre-modern times, the economies of what today is China and what today is India were far larger than any other country on the earth. So they were an economical powerhouse. They were admired by their neighbors, and getting a little bit more into that, their immediate neighbors, the Koreans, the Japanese, the Vietnamese, they borrowed heavily from China. They adopted Confucianism. They got Buddhism by way of China, though it originated in India, northern India. They, I forget if I said they adopted Confucianism, they adopted Chinese writing system until they each developed their own. But originally they were using Chinese. So for these reasons, China felt that they were the Middle Kingdom. Well, I unintentionally just answered this question, but so the Ming voyages also served to reinforce this notion that China was the center of the universe. And I'll add one other thing. So during the Qing dynasty, there's this notion that the Qing don't need to go out and explore foreign places. The Qing don't need to try to learn too much about other peoples. Other civilizations come to them, and other civilizations seek to learn from them and get trade goods from them. And so, what's the origin of that sort of notion of themselves as so great? Well, it comes from their experiences and their history. So the Qing dynasty, the word Qing is just the name of the dynasty. It means clear, distinct, but the knowing the name of the ethnic group is important for you to know. So what was the name of the ethnic group that established the Qing? I'll give you a moment to recall that. They were the Manchu or the Manzu, and they originally came from a place in northeastern, what is today northeastern China. It's a region that has historically been called Manchuria. And as I mentioned before, the Manzu or Manchu were an ethnic minority within China, comprising a very small fraction of China's total population. And they were originally a nomadic or semi nomadic people who were experienced at fighting on horseback. They were descended from various nomadic or semi nomadic peoples like the Jurchens, and they came from a place, a kind of terrain called the steppe, which you can see here, wide open grassland, somewhat mountainous areas interspersed with wide open grassland. And they lived in a way similar to the traditional way that Mongols live. So in Mongolia, they have these large tents that they can um, assemble and disassemble. They're called yurts. The Manchu had something similar. It probably has a different name, but I'm just going to say yurt for now. So the purpose of the slide is to emphasize to you the Manchu are distinct from the Han in many ways. They were a semi-nomadic. They lived at least partly in these tents. They wrote in a vertical script that you can see here that's similar to Tibetan because that's where they ultimately got it from. They also divided their society into banners. And originally there were 8 banners. When the Qing conquer China, they will have to expand the size of their banners. So they'll add Mongol and Han banners later on. But initially, when the Qing conquered China, they remained very separate from the Han majority. The Manchu lived in walled compounds, and they really concentrated power within the Manchu themselves. They also had a very unique hairstyle, this Q, which maybe had its origins in the fact that when you're riding on horseback and you draw your bow, the bowstring is against your cheek, and so when you release the bow, when you release the arrow, if you have long flowing hair, your hair might get caught in the bowstring. That's the explanation one explanation I found that seems to make sense to me as to why they would wear such an extreme hairstyle. But what you have to know for our course is that this ethnic minority imposed the hairstyle upon the population of China as a symbol of their subservience, the fact that they are subjects of the Qing rulers. So, looking ahead, when the Qing dynasty starts to weaken and things start to fall apart, it won't take long for the Han majority to find unity in their mutual hatred for the Qing. So, a question for you. What are some specific reasons why the Han are going to be quick to turn on their Manchu rulers? Give you a moment to think about that, then I will reveal the answers. So this is a dynasty where it's minority rule. At least initially, the Qing were quite aloof, living in their own walled compounds, not wanting to associate with the rest of China, giving the best, most plum government positions to other Manchus, favoring the Manchu language, imposing the Q people. Now, as the Qing dynasty progressed, they incorporated tons of Han Chinese into government and into the military, as you saw. But nevertheless, there was always that notion that the Manchu were somehow superior. All right, so the Grand Canal gets mentioned throughout Spence's book, and it's important to understand what it was. The Grand Canal was over 2,000 kilometers of hand-dug waterways linking 5 of China's river basins. It stretched from approximately Beijing in the north down to Shanghai in central coastal China. The Grand Canal was not built by the Qing. It was many dynasties. It was started many dynasties before the Qing dynasty. But it's important during the Qing because this is the backbone of China's inland communication and transportation network. So think of this as the Interstate 95 of pre-modern China. You can use this waterway to transport food, enormous volumes of food. You could transport armies this way. Your police force can be transported along it. If the emperor wants to take a tour of his dominion, he can travel along it, as Qianlong will. We'll see in a subsequent video. And it also facilitates the spread of news and information along this waterway. To help you understand the scope of this thing, it would be as if there was a very wide, hand-dug canal from Memphis, Tennessee to Norwalk, Connecticut. These pictures here are images of sections of the Grand Canal that still exist today. Some of them are more narrow, like the picture on the left, but some of them are quite wide, like the picture on the right, where barges could pass one another going in opposite directions. So in class, I had you look at this map as a way of thinking about yet another value of the Grand Canal. So pause here, take a look at the map, figure out what the map is illustrating, and then based on this map, what additional benefit was provided by the Grand Canal? I've added the Grand Canal as a blue line here going from Beijing to Shanghai. So take a moment and then I will give the answer. So the focus of the map is the different kinds of crops that can grow in the different temperature zones within China. So what does the Grand Canal do? Well, the Grand Canal links together different climate zones that are growing different types of crops at different parts of the year. So what that does is it means that within China's heartland, the population is going to have access to a greater variety of food throughout the year, really enhancing their nutrition. And it also means if there is a poor harvest or a flood or a drought or a typhoon in one part of China, you could rush resources to that area from a different part of China along the Grand Canal. So that leads me to the next point. In the text, in this course, when the Grand Canal fails, it's a really big deal for China. It puts tremendous strain on the country and the government. And I want you to understand why that is. So, question, why is it crucial that the emperors maintain the canals by dredging them, shoring up the embankments along either side? Why is it really bad if the Grand Canal fills up with silt or if the Grand Canal is unusable? Take a moment to think about that and then I'll explain. So if the Grand Canal fails, that means there is going to be a shutdown in food transportation, movement of the military, spread of information. And what I compared it to is a few recent things that have happened here in the US. A little while back, there was a barge that hit a bridge. It was the Francis Scott Key Bridge down in Baltimore. And when the barge hit that bridge, it massively disrupted transportation all along the East Coast of the United States. Another example, not that long ago, a truck crashed in Norwalk, Connecticut, and it damaged, it shut down the highway, but it also, the fire damaged the overpass that was above where the truck had crashed, and it totally messed up traffic throughout the region. So for those reasons, that's why in the book, or when we talk about the Grand Canal filling up with silt or the Grand Canal failing, it's a really big deal and it's going to have really catastrophic consequences. I spent quite a bit of time explaining how silk, porcelain, and tea are made. For the purposes of this video, just know that these are three products that China makes and China has developed over hundreds of years. They have perfected over hundreds of years. China doesn't have a complete monopoly on all of these things. Other countries are capable of silk, porcelain, and tea production, but China has a near monopoly because not only do they know how to make it, but they can make it very well in enormous quantities. So thinking about these trade goods, which are extremely desirable, how does this also contribute to this idea of the Middle Kingdom concept? Think about that for a moment. You can hit pause and then I'll reveal the answer. The idea here is that China makes these products, they're extremely valuable, and other countries, even very advanced countries, will travel from the far sides of the world to come to China to get those products. Case in point for us, Britain, an advanced country that's creating an empire of their own, they simply cannot get enough tea and porcelain and silk. So they travel across the world in order to gain access to those things, thus enhancing China's view of themselves. Wow, these barbarians from the small desolate island on the other side of the world came all the way over here and risked life and limb in order to get these products. We must be so great. All right, and the last part of the presentation, when thinking about imperial China, you will say, oh, well, there's an emperor, and so the emperor is in charge, the emperor is the boss. The purpose of these next slides is to establish that there are other factions within court, and these factions can have a lot of influence, and these factions often are at odds with one another for the direction that they think China should go in. So, though China is an imperial country and they have an emperor, it's important to understand there are other powers which are influential. The ranks of Chinese government are filled by Confucian scholars. These are men who have devoted their entire life to studying the Confucian classics in order to take exams which grant them the ability to work at different levels of government. This is a meritocratic system, meaning that in order to work in a position in society, you have to prove your merit. This was a novel idea for the time, as many societies on Earth gave people power based on their lineage, based on their relationship to another person, not based on skill. So this is how it's supposed to work on paper. You dedicate yourself to studying the Confucian classics. You spend a lot of money and resources in order to do that. Then you take an exam. If you pass the exam, it gives you the opportunity. It opens you up for a small local government position. And then if you pass subsequent exams, you can get higher and higher positions in government until you pass the Jinshi exam, at which point you could be a scholar working in the court of the emperor. The second group is the concubines. These are women that live within the forbidden city, and their primary function is to produce male heirs for the emperor. With a few exceptions, they're mostly confined to this one part of the forbidden city where men are not allowed to go. These women oftentimes start from nothing. They're not educated, but in the process of becoming a concubine, they receive some cultural education. And it's important to mention them because in some cases in Chinese history, concubines played a really important role in the China's direction in China's history. The most famous example that we're going to study is the Empress Dowager Cixi. She started out, in fact, as a concubine. Now, I said that men couldn't go into that part of the Forbidden City. That wasn't exactly true. There's another category of people, and those are the eunuchs. Eunuchs are men of very low standing in society who get castrated in the hopes that they could be inducted into the ranks of the eunuchs within the Forbidden City. Like concubinage, this is like a really extreme attempt at upward social mobility, trying to change your family's station in life. And since they were castrated, they could operate in all parts of the Forbidden City, as there was no chance that they could impregnate a concubine and create an illegitimate heir. I am mentioning the eunuchs because they too, at various points in Chinese history, wielded great influence. An example of someone that we talked about here in this presentation is Yongle. Oh, I'm sorry. The Muslim eunuch Zheng He, who was going on the voyages for Emperor Yongle. Sorry about that. Lastly, we have a category of people, ministers of various government bodies, who are not necessarily Confucian scholars. To wrap things up, the reason why I've talked about these different groups within the court is because I want you to understand that the emperor is not making decisions single-handedly. There are these other groups that can influence the emperor's views, and also these different factions within court will sometimes compete with one another or vie with one another for power and influence. That's all for today's video. In our next video, we're going to take a close look at Emperor Qianlong himself. Thanks for watching.